We are up and running, and it's a few days after Christmas and a few days before New Year's, and we will be seeing the end of 2016 with this kind of a mass illusion of all the people that we love in Hollywood croaking on us at the end of this year. It's been a strange, strange year. How are you this morning, Barrett?
I'm doing all right. I'm doing all right. And yeah, thinking about heading into that new year, 2017, coming just a few days from now. It does remind me a little bit of that line from the Course that we should make this year different by making it all the same. And I think what Jesus is telling us is that we can see in every situation, no matter how different it is, we can see that same opportunity for growth, for kindness, for compassion, for remembering, as you just said, that the things that happen here are not the truth, and that we don't need to give the power to them to take away our peace. And yeah, even with all these celebrities, a lot of whom I really liked transitioning, I think remembering to see it in that light, it helps make it a little smoother experience.
That's very true. It basically is just the shell, the little toy car they drove through the world. And even though they left good memories, nonetheless, it was not who they actually were. We were actually witnessing the Christ within every one of those individuals. And so there is that commonality in making everything the same, as you said. Although I was grief stricken when I heard that the guy who played Alf, the alien in the 80s TV sitcom, had transitioned, because I was a huge fan of Alf.
Mm.
His acerbic sense of humor always seemed to give me that little uplift I needed.
I hadn't heard that one, but yeah, that's. I loved Elf too when I was a kid. I watched that quite a bit.
Yeah, that was a good one. That and Third Rock from the Sun. There was more reality in those two shows than the entire experience of 2016, start to finish, is what I'm thinking.
It has been quite a year. It has been quite a year, and I think when we look back at this year, we can really see that in all the ups and downs that we've had, that's just a reflection of this world being a reflection of dualism, and that when we see that if we believe in opposites, we're going to get opposites, then it's no surprise that this world is showing us a lot of really good stuff and a lot of really bad stuff. And we start to really think of this, okay, as what would be normal. If we really honestly look at any year that's transpired in the history of humankind, there's going to be a lot of good and there's going to be a lot of bad. And as we start to have that perspective, I think the shocks, the challenges, the pains, they get at least less surprising. They might still hurt, they might still be challenging to deal with, but they don't seem to be quite so out of left field. And that perspective can help us as we're going through these things. And I think, I don't know, that's one way that will help us as we reflect back on the year that has happened and the year that will be coming up shortly.
Exactly. And one thing that helps me a lot in my practice is to keep going back to referring to this whole thing as a movie that we're watching. And everybody is just doing their part. They are playing the role that was given to them in that initial separation. So when we see somebody who says something that is just absolute gibberish to our mind, they're in the role, they're playing that role. And if you take them seriously, then it becomes very easy to condemn and attack. But if you step back and say, oh, I'm watching a movie and this is one of the crazies or one of the bad guys, and that's just part of the script. But the truth is, at the core of the individual, the Christ is there shining through. And that's, that's when we step aside and ask the Holy Spirit to reveal to us the truth of all of the players on the stage, so that we don't take the play seriously and we can appreciate the core essence of the divinity within each member of the play that's out there acting out in the world.
Yeah, and it's not always easy, but it is always a good thing to remember that that light, that spark, that divine truth that is in each of us is in all of us. And there can be times where someone, as you said, is acting in the role of someone who seems to be insane. But what we realize is that that light is in them, and really the ego that is in them is in us as well. To realize that we are not unique, we are not somehow different than them, that we have the same right mind, we have the same wrong mind, and we have the same ability to choose one or the other. And that sameness is really this world's reflection of the divine truth of our oneness. And as we just stand in the sameness more and more, it does lead us to this experience of knowing our oneness. So we just keep moving forward one step at a time, one step at a time, one situation at a time, one situation at a time, using these ideas, using these perspectives to help us, get back to a place of peace. And I think it really leads us into the part of the text that Chris and I are going to be talking about today, which is chapter 23, which is the war against yourself. And I think just the very title is pretty evocative of our situation, that all the different stresses, all the different challenges that we face are actually things that we have kind of wanted for ourselves. And it's not easy to see this. It's not easy to look at this, because on one level we would say, hey, I don't want that. I don't want that suffering. I don't want that pain. But as we accept more and more the power of our mind, to choose anything that it wants, we realize, as the workbook says, that we are not the victims of the world we see. And then we do start to see that on some level we have been wanting the challenges and the pains and the struggles. But the good news is that as we realize that, we stop being the victim to them. And that is the pathway through them, and is the pathway beyond them. And that's, I think, what this section is going to be leading us through.
Absolutely, yeah. It starts off with kind of laying the groundwork here, giving us some clear definitions about what it is that we need to embrace in order to be able to be invulnerable in a world that's filled with the appearance of hate and attack and crime and everything else. It says, do you not see the opposite of frailty and weakness is sinlessness? Innocence is strength, and nothing else is strong. The sinless cannot fear, for sin of any kind is weakness. The show of strength attack would use to cover frailty conceals it not. For how can the unreal be hidden? Strong who has an enemy. Boy, do I ever love that line. No one is strong who has an enemy. Means do we go out there and create for ourselves and engender for ourselves in our own mind? And it goes on to say, and no one can attack unless he thinks he has. Belief in enemies is therefore the belief in weakness, and what is weak is not the will of God. Being opposed to it, it is God's enemy, and God is feared as an opposing will. And that takes us back to the struggle we have in walking through all of these landmines and arriving at the doorstep of higher consciousness, where that union with God is becomes an approachable thing. We have all these hidden agendas. We have all these people who we believe are hateful and mean and evil, and who have done horrible things to us, or that we have done horrible things to. It's this massive wall that doesn't so much block God out as it keeps us trapped within our own illusion, within our own fear space.
Yeah, yeah. And it's this false image of God that all of us have on some level deep within that is really one of the things that makes this course often feel hard or challenging. One of the experiences I think is pretty much universal among course students is this conflict that we have within ourselves where we want this peace, we want this love, we want this truth. And then all the ways that we find to not, choose love, to not choose joy, to be angry, judgmental, and suffering in some way. And we kind of are like, well, why do I keep doing this? And I think it's this false image of God that we have is the answer to that. That if we see God as some vindictive monster who's out to punish us, and we certainly get that representation of God from a lot of the world's religions, in particular the Old Testament, the God of war, the God of punishment, then we're not going to want to approach God. We're not going to want to come back to love. We're not going to want to know truth if we think truth is out to get us. So a big part of our work with this is actually undoing this false idea of God and of ourselves as somehow judgmental, somehow angry, somehow how punishing, because that is not the truth. And even as we get consciously that's not the truth, there still may be unconscious layers that are buying into this idea, and allowing them to come forward, allowing them to be seen, so that they can melt away, they can be forgiven, is a big part of our healing progress.
That's very true. And within that, looking back at the Abrahamic religions, the book of Genesis starts off with a dialogue about a God that is spirit, creating a child that is spirit. And then in chapter 2, we have a new kind of God, a new vision of God that emerges. And this God is kind of fumbling around. He's not really terribly competent. And the first thing he does is he throws a little spittle into a pile of dust and makes a mud man. And then after the mud man is created, he animates it. Well, if you go back to Jewish tradition, that sounds very much like a golem, which is false man, which is kind of scary and creepy. And from that point, it just gets, wilder and wilder and more out of control. And then we see that very same God whose ark is being transported in the book of Exodus. And that God says nobody but a Levite can touch the ark. And it looks like the ark is going to fall off of the shoulders of the men who are transporting it. And someone who is not a Levite tries to shore it up, push it forward, and God strikes that person dead. So we do have a really horrific image of God that is presented to us as an alternative to that initial God, which is peace and love and spirit and invulnerable and non-judgmental and eternal. So you can see how right off the get-go, we like to weave in our own themes into the idea of who God is and what God's response to man is. And it is not only terrifying, but that people have ever since, the origin of all these things, 5,777 years ago, have pointed out and referenced and said, oh, this is, why you need to fear God. So it's really embedded in our collective consciousness. And all of these little Christians out there as missionaries are spreading those visions of fear and loathing and all the other dark things. So it really is up to us to not go out and counter it, but to live in our truth, and by example, allow people to momentarily entertain the idea of a God that is not a God of vengeance and a God of fire and brimstone. So I think that's, the beauty of how it's presented in this section in the course is it gets us back to recognizing that the stories around God that are dark and horrific and scary are absolutely, figmented by our own imagination. And in truth, when we allow ourselves to become still, we can actually begin to experience that peace that God extends to us, even in this mortal world.
Yeah, and I think what you're sharing fits right in with paragraph 4, where he says, "Let not the little interferers pull you to littleness. There can be no attraction of guilt in innocence. Think what a happy world you walk with truth beside you. Do not give up this world of freedom for a little sigh of seeming sin, nor for a tiny stirring of guilt's attraction. Would you, for all these meaningless distractions, lay heaven aside? Your destiny and purpose are far beyond them, in the clean place where littleness does not exist." So here he's really helping us to see that we have the choice. We have the choice whether we are going to choose littleness again in all the different ways that it presents itself to us, or whether we're going to stay in that more expansive state of love, of peace, of joy. And what sometimes is not as clear is the fact that we're actually choosing this at all times throughout the day. That in every moment we are either choosing to hold Jesus' hand, hold the Holy Spirit's hand, or we're choosing the ego's hand. And it's always, one or the other. As Jesus says, there are only two thought systems, and there's nothing else to choose. In this world of multiplicity, in this world of many, many things, it does look like we have a lot of things to choose from. But what we're talking about here is we're talking about the perspective that you have as you go through your life. And that perspective is something that is always a choice that you can make. Now, remembering that you have that choice to make sometimes is the harder thing, because and a lot of times we're kind of on autopilot, or we're not realizing that we have that access to love in that moment. But it is always there. And the more that we practice, it becomes like a muscle that we're working out as we exercise. And it gets stronger, it gets more available. It gets to the point where we can choose that no matter what is facing us in this world. And that's when this war against ourself really starts to end. And we find that we don't need to be at war with ourselves. I think I watched the new Star Wars movie a week or so ago, and it was really pretty good. But it reminds me of a scene in the first series of Star Wars movies where Luke goes into this dark cave. And when he goes into the dark cave, he encounters Darth Vader. But when he attacks Darth Vader, he actually finds that it was himself all along. And I think that's a really evocative image that helps us to see that everything we're struggling against is really ultimately ourself. And because of that, we can lay down our weapons and we can find a way of being with it that is peaceful and that is joyful.
Very true. And one of the things that I look at, I've started to really train myself to observe, is which voice I am listening to throughout the day. And if you are listening to the voice that is observing and judging in any way. This is good, this is bad. Oh, look at this moron. This person over here is an ascended soul, and I should be on my knees in front of him. And that person over there is just, all of that chatter that's always going on. That is the ego mind. And you'll discover that when you're listening to the mind of spirit and rejecting the ego, then you have more and more extended periods of quiet. And that's when that sense of a presence within you starts to actually come forth. And whatever thoughts you have tend to go in the direction of benevolence and of compassion and of acceptance. And so most people, I would say, are listening to the ego about 99.9% of the time of the day. To even draw back 10% of that during the course of a day is monumental. It can be a huge step in the direction of achieving success and moving your life over to that side of living more in spirit and living less in that presence of the ego. So just a simple, thoughtfulness that is sustained throughout the day. What am I hearing? What am I allowing myself to project? What am I allowing myself to believe in? Is the first huge step in this process of getting back to the place where we can actually surrender our sense of being sinful, and surrender our sense of having enemies, and surrender our sense of alienation, of being separate. So I would say that for this coming year, if you can just, every day, start your day out with that repetition, with that awareness that when your thoughts start heading down that direction of condemnation or negativity or any kind of chatter, because most of it, when you stop and think about it, is meaningless anyway. You don't need to have an opinion about this person or that person. But when you can step away from that, even briefly throughout the day, that sets a mode in the mind. It sets an intention in the mind. And the mind can be drawn back more and more to listening to that presence of serenity within, and dismissing, overlooking, and releasing that antagonistic, ego-centered, constant rhetoric that we all seem to be guilty of generating.
Yeah, and I think that's beautiful. And I think, we can go right back to that saying, to make this year different by making it all the same. And by making it all the same, we're actually developing a good habit. And the good habit is to choose that love, as you're saying, and to recognize when we're not, and to not be hard on ourselves when we notice that we're back in judgment, we're back in fear, but to just say, okay, there's still some ego left that I'm holding on to, but I don't need to keep holding on to it. And the more that we can do that, the more we find ourselves just resting in that heart of love. And that becomes our whole purpose here. Even as we go through everything else that's happening in our lives, we know that our deepest purpose here is to know the truth that we are, and to see that truth not just in ourselves, but in everyone that we meet. And I think it's very fitting that as we've been talking, Chris, that light through your window has been at times enveloping you, because that's the symbol. The symbol is let the light envelop you because it is you. And I think that's a nice way for us to ring in the new year.
Absolutely. Just real fast here, this last paragraph says, nothing around you but is part of you. I like that. Look on it lovingly and see the light of heaven in it. So you've got all these players positioned on the stage. You've got all these accoutrements on the stage. And if you step back and give it some love, look at it with a loving and accepting acknowledgement that this is my creation, and that if I bring the presence of the divine into it, if I bring love into it, I can see it transformed. It goes on to say, so will you come to understand all that is given you. In kind forgiveness will the world sparkle and shine, and everything you once thought sinful now will be reinterpreted as part of heaven. So this is giving us a very high standard to attain, but think of how joyful your life would become if you could see everything glistening with that presence of the divine within it. So yes, Barrett, it has been a strange 2016, but I think 2017 may be even stranger. Who knows?
Well, as long as we go forward into it with love in our hearts and that sparkle that you're talking about, then I think we're going to be well served. So it's been a real honor to be doing these recordings with you this year, Chris, and I look forward to many more. As you were saying, we're nearing number 100, so it's a little over 2 years ago that we started doing these recordings, and they are a real gift to me. So I just want to express that gratitude and let you know how much I appreciate you, my friend.
Yes, absolutely. That goes both ways, because these discussions have been an astonishing stimulant for growth and evolution, and stepping more and more into a space of recognizing love, not wanting love, but recognizing that it's already there.
Beautiful.
So I will see you next year, my friend.
All right. We'll see you next week and next year. Have a great one. Have a good time ringing in 2017.
Absolutely. And all of our viewers, get out there and rejoice, because the light is trying to find you. And if you just stand still and be quiet for a minute, it will emerge.
Nice. All right. Be well.
Goodbye.
Bye.